So as I said, and just for the benefit of those who'll be watching this on podcast, today all of the lectionaries were from Lamentations and the Psalms, the penitential Psalms where they're crying out to God. And Habakkuk, where he was speaking of them in exile, and the New Testament passages were where we're compared to slaves, or where Timothy was grieving. All of these things where we're just forced to ask, God, are you still there? God, do you still care? They are very difficult passages, but all of them speak about, what's sometimes referred to as the dark night of the soul, where we just cry out and go, God, is my faith misplaced? Are you actually there? Are you real? Or God, are you punishing me? The reverse of prosperity doctrine is actually, the bad things that happen to bad people. So if something's going wrong, that must be you. That must be your fault. And we're forced, and I don't agree with that at all, just so you know, but we're tempted to think, what did I do wrong, God? Why are you doing this to me? All of these passages are exceedingly dark. But I want to start just with a comment that a scholar by the name of Ellen Davis makes that speaks wonders to the fact that these verses are even in the Bible to start with. In the ancient world, as there are today, there were many religions, many ideas, many churches or temples, and they all had preachers, they all had prophets, they all had their holy writings or holy books. Many things stand apart about our God, but this is yet one more of them. In no other culture, says this scholar, did people pray to their God in a language that was so frank and even rude. Listen to this one verse from one section. This is what a writer is speaking to God and says, God, you crushed us and made us a haunt for jackals. You covered us with a deep darkness. And yet for your sake we face death all day long. We are considered sheep to be slaughtered. Lord, awake. Rouse yourself. Do not keep rejecting us forever. Why do you hide your face and forget our misery and oppression? Does that sound like somebody who's trying to build a relationship with God? Is that how you would start to get to know your God? Or if you wanted God to do something, would you start in that accusative phase? And that was just like 3 sentences. There are chapters of the Bible that just keep continuing. Would you do that, honestly? If God was a person and you could speak to him, would you start like that? Probably not. And in the ancient world, you never would have. Only followers of Yahweh prayed this kind of complaint prayer, but it was for a very good reason. Only Israel, in all of the old world, believed that the great God of heaven, who made heaven and earth, actually cared about the people that he'd made and could be expected to do something about it. Every other religion, it was only about appeasing or bribing the gods that they followed so that they would help you. You would never dare bring this level of anger towards any of the other gods of the day. You just wouldn't do it. But it was a completely different revelation of Yahweh to the Israelites, of God to us. It is so important that our prayer life, when we cry out to a God, it's authentic. Now, I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but God is omnipotent and omniscient. That means he is everywhere and he knows everything. So you bringing a prayer to him is not actually giving God any new information that he didn't already have access to. Okay? Your prayer is not for God's benefit. Your prayer is actually for your benefit. It's actually to build your heart, to build your relationship with him. So, and it does quite a few things. When you pray with authenticity, when you actually say, these are my struggles, this is what I'm going through, you start to connect with your heart. Even in a fight, even if you are fighting somebody and are arguing, maybe not to the point of fisticuffs, but if you're actually in an argument, I mean, Carly and I have gotten in a few arguments over the years, haven't we? No fisticuffs. No. I'm scared. I'm too scared. She's got a punching bag and punching gloves. I'm too scared. No fisticuffs, but we've had some pretty good arguments over the years. And you know what? Occasionally I've been right. Sometimes Carly's been right. But on the back end of those arguments, on the back end of that fight, when we've actually had the opportunity to just let our emotions go at each other, we actually come away from that closer to each other and knowing more about each other and sharing the same heart as each other than before we started. Now, it's not a perfect analogy. God would win a few more arguments than I do. But it's a good analogy. When we rant and rail at God and say, God, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you involved in this situation? Why aren't you doing this? Why are you letting this oppression go on? Why are you letting this injustice go? Guess where your heart is? Your heart is now starting to address that injustice, that unfairness, that guilt. Hello, Sarah. So first of all, it connects our heart to God. And we start to share God's heart. Because you know what? If God is passionately against something and we are passionately against the same thing, that's a great opportunity for God to actually team up with us and say, okay. You look at the story of Moses. Moses hated slavery. And guess what? God hated slavery. And God and Moses had a bit of a knockdown at a big burning tree. And then they started working together. And if Moses had have been, oh no, I can't speak to God. Well, actually he was. He was like, I can't come too close. It's holy ground. But if he hadn't have actually been willing to engage with God there, God would have freed the slaves some other way. But Moses would have missed out on an amazing opportunity. So that's the first thing it does. And that's very important because, in today's world, I can speak of other gods, but the other gods we have today are things like success or money, or political influence. But guess what? You can't build a relationship with those things. You can use them. More often than not, they use you. You become addicted to them. But they become our functional gods when we give everything we have to those things. You can't build a relationship with them. But your heart still follows there, but nothing can ever come back. But when we are free to actually express all emotions, positive and negative, to God, that builds our relationship with Him, and that helps safeguard us from connecting deeply with money or politics in unhealthy ways. We should be using money, we should be using politics. Listen to the last 2 podcasts, but not in unhealthy ways. The other thing it stops us doing, though, is also getting crushed under the weight of expectations and the weight of things. If you don't feel you can take your pain, your grief, your agony to God, then who's going to help you deal with that? If it is oppression, by definition, you don't have the strength to deal with that by yourself. You are oppressed. If it is injustice, you may or may not be able to actually handle that on your own. But there is so much injustice in this world, you can't deal with all of it on your own. And you might be able to build a little community and God has raised up thousands and thousands of little communities to deal with bits of injustice around the world. And they should be championed. But we can't do everything on our own. And if we try and we don't call God into this, we will eventually be crushed just by the weight of what is going on in this world. So in these laments, in these darker psalms, what we see is a God who is actually committed to justice. God actually passionately hates things like slavery and sin and the effect it has on this world. But God is actually wanting to build a relationship with us, heart to heart, to actually do something about that, to give us a hope and a peace as well, to work in our hearts and then work through us. So what I want to do is I just want to step through just the first of these lectionaries, just Lamentations 1. And I want to show, just how dark it actually got for this writer and author, and just, sometimes we feel, oh God, you've never solved a problem this big before. Yeah, he has. I want to look at, Lamentations 1 and why it was written and what was going on, and then what changed in the author. So this is Lamentations 1 through 6. How lonely sits the city that was once full of people. How like a widow she has become. She that was great amongst the nations, she that was a princess amongst the provinces, has become a slave or a vassal. She weeps bitterly in the night with tears on her cheeks, and among all her lovers she has no one to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They've become her enemies. Judah's gone into exile with suffering and hard servitude. She lives now scattered amongst the nations and finds no resting place. Her pursuers have overtaken her in the midst of her distress. The road to Zion mourns. No one comes to the festivals anymore. Her gates are desolate. Her priests groan. Her young girls grieve. Her lot is bitter. Her foes, they've become her masters. Her enemies, they prosper because the Lord has made her suffering for the multitude of his transgressions. That's a little bit of an uncomfortable sentence, isn't it? Her children have gone away, captives before the foe, and from daughter Zion has departed all her majesty. Her princes have become like stags that find no pasture, and they have fled without strength before their pursuers. This was written in the time of exile, and the author is reflecting on the loss of Jerusalem and the scattering and destruction of Israel. Some writers have tried to make modern parallels to, what group of people would actually be experiencing this today. Now, there is a lot of suffering in the world today, and this actually does happen in a lot of places that, the news doesn't even get to. Entire towns in Syria are just bombed. In the Western world, best examples that we would probably be familiar with, how would the people of Hiroshima have felt after the bomb? Or how would the people of Khan felt at the end of World War II when that city was systematically destroyed for a greater victory? And it wasn't just the physical things that had been lost here. I want to give you a sense of just how deeply pained and hurting this person was. Because you have to remember what God had called the Jews and Israel to be. They were meant to be a light to the nations. They were meant to be God's ambassadors to the rest of the world. And they had found their purpose, their identity in this. And it had sort of become all intertwined with the temple, rooted in the God who resided there. And so when they were driven from their home, when they were driven away from the temple, they had not only lost their homes, they had not only lost their city and their neighbours and their belongings, but they had also lost their purpose. They had lost their identity as to who they were, both as individuals and as a nation. How many of us have actually struggled with that? We've either haven't had a purpose in life, or we found one and then it was crueled away from us and taken away. Who here struggled through that? Yeah. And the writer of this was going through not just a one-off event, but for their lifetime and for the next generation and the next generation. Their stated purpose in life had been taken away and stripped away from them. This is the level of anguish that this writer is bringing. One preacher who was preaching on this same thing said, a good analogy might have actually been if you were an investment banker or, a business person in New York on 9/11. It's not healthy, but those people found their identity in how much money they could make, how much business they could get. And then they saw that destroyed in an instant, knowing that it would never be rebuilt in their business lifetime. And there was a lot of suicides and a lot of health issues afterwards, not related to the actual towers, but business people that had lost their purpose, lost their life. So you have to imagine an entire country generationally experiencing that level of grief. And this is the writer of Lamentations. But what's happened here is that God had actually allowed this to happen. The people of Israel, not all of them, but as a whole, they'd sort of made this subtle shift. They were meant to be God's ambassadors, but they'd sort of made it about the temple instead. As long as we have the temple, as long as God said you're the chosen ones, you're the ones light to the nation, we can do whatever we want because God's always on our side. And we'll have Yahweh, we'll have God, but we'll have a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B, a little bit of column C. And their hearts, remember where I started, remember that I said God's heart is to actually build a relationship with us and partner with us and build that community. And Israel's heart had gone anywhere but God. We have the temple, he's protecting us, we can do this and we can take this religion and this religion and this religion, we can take all the blessing God gives us and then give it to all these other gods. And that was the one thing that God was not going to stand by and abide. Now, just as an aside here, we can see that in our political world today, can't we? In 5 weeks, there's an election in America which is not going to have a good outcome no matter what happens. The news today is the start of Brexit. Britain leaving the EU kicks off today in a few hours because of the time zone. Australian politics, I won't comment too deeply, but to say it's well settled and functioning properly would probably be about as far from the truth as I could get away with without being political. But they're all after something else, aren't they? Money or power or influence. A long time ago, a lot of politicians stopped trying to serve. Because a politician's purpose should be to actually serve those he represents or she represents. And they get used to the trappings of power, the trappings of how they are serving through the temple. For Israel, it was through the temple. For our politicians, it's the trappings of government. And they never intend to go that way, but just one step after the next, it can happen. I didn't mean to go sort of political. It's just, this was an aside. We can see there's nothing new in history. History just keeps repeating. Israel thought they could keep piling up sin upon sin and God will always let them get away with it. And eventually they were conquered in 2 waves. The southern kingdom fell and then the northern kingdom, and they're now in exile. And the writer is weeping. And as dark a picture as I just painted before, it wasn't just about what had happened. It was also the future that they were never going to have as well, that they couldn't see. As I said, this was generational exile. You can listen to the words. The princess has become a slave. The road to Zion mourns. They'd lost their monarchy. They'd lost their business. They'd lost their celebrations. I said at the start, God calls us to celebrate, and we should celebrate, but they couldn't do that either. The young girls grieve. The next generation is not going to actually marry and create the next generation of Israelites. They were just in tears because all of their hope had been taken away. I've attended 2 funerals this year, and it was a different type of pain. I attended one this week. Carly's grandfather had actually passed away. Very old age. It was expected, but he had lived a full life. And I didn't realise how full a life until I actually sat and listened to the eulogy, and he had lived an amazing life and left an amazing legacy behind. And there was a certain level of grief there, but it was a grief with hope. He had died as part of a wonderful faith community. And he had left a legacy behind, not just genetically, but he had actually left so many, he'd started up things for kids to go sailing and donated massively to that, and it had set up youth groups and had set up so many things, and he had left a great legacy that will echo long after he's gone. And so whilst there was a grief that, we're never going to get to talk to him again, at least this side of eternity, the grief wasn't all-consuming, because there was hope, and there was cause for celebration. But the other funeral I went to this year was actually for a young child that would have been my nephew, but never got to take a breath outside the womb. And I won't go into details, but at that funeral, I was in tears. I was unconsolable. Because it wasn't just the loss, it was everything that Tej could have been. The joy that he could have brought into this world, the relationships he could have built, the legacy he could have left, the hope he could have brought, everything that God had designed him to be. And I was sitting there going, God, how could you? God, why did you let this happen? God, you knit us together in our mother's womb and you did a terrible job. I'm just being real. That's what I wanted to say to God, and that's exactly what I was saying to God. God, how did you let this happen? God, you screwed up. Now I know God doesn't make mistakes, but that didn't make my emotions any less real. There was just cause for anger and grief at that point. But you know what? This is why God gives us lamentations. This is why God gives us psalms. Because in expressing that, in actually taking that to God, two very important additional things happen. The first thing, and this might not be obvious to us, is that we also end up taking that to the communities that we're a part of. At that funeral, we were together as a group and we were able to mourn together, and that actually knitted us together. And you know what? The Austin clan is actually a much tighter group now than a year ago. It actually knit the community together. When you read through Lamentations, you have to remember they didn't have computers back then. They didn't just bang out some text or bang out an angry meme or something onto social media. If they had to actually write something down, it took time, it took effort, and it was intended to be shared. The writer of Lamentations is wanting to get their grief out to the rest of the community, and in doing so, that actually ties the community together and actually draws it together. As a church, that's one of the things we should be doing. Where are we struggling? Where is our grief? Let's actually come together and share and draw together as a community and find strength in those that God has called us around. Dealing with pain and suffering and loss, we learn through just the sheer act of writing Lamentations. It actually draws us together closer than any joy or celebration could. But the second thing it does is it actually gives us a release. It gives us some sort of catharsis to actually get it out of our system. All of us have actually raged or been angry or been, just wanting to take revenge, haven't we? I'm not going to ask us to put our hands up, because all of us at one point in our life have just sought revenge or rage. And if we bottle that up inside, it just turns toxic. It can't stay there forever without staining our soul, staining our heart. That rage has to come out somewhere. And sometimes we can find little releases, in exercise or in sport or, just getting a punching bag and, letting rip for a while. But that's only short term. That rage needs to come out somewhere. Listen to what this was one of the other psalms. This was the psalm in the lectionary today. This is Psalm 137. And if you want to talk about somebody where rage is bottled up and just needs to come out, this is it. This is it from the same time period. By the river of Babylon, we sat and we wept and we remembered Zion. On the willows, we hung up our harps. For there our captors ask us for songs and our tormentors ask for mirth. So he's saying we hung up our instruments because we refuse to play because our tormentors are just teasing us. Oh, play us a song of your God. So he says, sing us a song of Zion. But how could we sing in the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you. Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites, the day of Jerusalem's fall. And now this is the bad bit. They said, tear it down to its foundations. O daughter, Babylon, that you devastated one, blessed be those who repay you with the recompense for what you have repaid us. Blessed are those who seize your infants and dash them amongst the rocks. That's in the Bible. The writer here is asking God to bless those who would take the infants of their enemies and smash them into the rocks. Now, God's obviously not going to do that. So why is this in the Bible? It's because rage has only one safe place, and that is before the Lord. We have a problem with road rage. We have a problem with alcoholism. We have a problem with, domestic abuse and violence in this world. We have the American gun culture, which doesn't need any commentary, with people just taking their rage out on anybody and everybody random just because it has to come out somewhere. And a scholar 20 years ago puts it very simple. Her name was Miros Lohoff, said, rage belongs before the Lord. It is the only safe place for it. Because what this does is it actually gets it out of our heart and says, you know what, God? You're going to have to deal with this. God, this is how I feel. God, I'm going to give you the full download of my emotions because it's the only safe place for this thought, for this emotion, for this grief, for this rage. God, I'm going to unload on you because you're the only one around me big enough to actually take this level of toxicity. And then, God, I'm going to let go. And God, you can bring justice in your way. When we ask for someone to be blessed, we ask for God's will to be done in their life. And so the writer here, when he says, blessed be those who do this, it's not that God, you have your way with the enemies of Babylon. That's all I can do. I'm going to have to step back because otherwise I'm just going to bring destruction on my family and so many others. Now, I said I wouldn't leave us in this negative. I said I wouldn't leave us in this darkness because there is a grace note, there is hope, even in Lamentations. Because we can look at the end of Lamentations and we see something quite amazing, quite remarkable. Now, this actually comes from Lamentations 3, and I will just give a little explanatory note. The biblical scholars have actually found Lamentations was 5 different laments, and they were all put together through history, and they were put together in the wrong order. So 1, 2, 4, and 5 came first, and they can date those, and then 3 actually came sometime later. They can't date, but it was at the end. So Lamentations 3 actually is at the end of the time period, if you're reading things chronologically. But this is Lamentations 3, 19 through 26. He says, the thought of my affliction and my homelessness is wormwood and gall. My soul continually thinks of it and is bowed down within me. So he's still struggling. He is still without a home. He is still pining to get back to Israel and actually for it to be restored. So it's not as if the issue has been resolved. But, he says, this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies, they never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Those words sound familiar, don't they? This comes out of Lamentations, the book of deepest grief, and this is what the writer finishes with. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul that seeks him. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. And I'm actually going to pick up on that sentence in a second. Now, those first two stanzas, as I said, they let us know that the pain is still there. It's still real. And there will probably be more venting and more grieving to come. But he has learned, I will call this to mind, he says, that I have hope. And that last sentence, it is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. Do you know that actually did happen? After Israel had been sent into exile the last time, we speak of the 600 years or the 400 years of silence between the end of the Old Testament and the start of the New. The writer of Lamentations says we should wait in silence, we should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord, and salvation came. Those that had been conquered time and again by foreign powers who had been oppressed for all this time, God stepped in. 600 years later, but God stepped in and said, enough is enough. I will meet them there and will restart this redemptive journey. I said at the beginning that Israel stood apart as the only nation where they were actually free to speak to God this way in their texts, in their books. And it was just a little foretaste, because they would end up being the only faith where God actually came down to us. And you've got to be sure that, I'm sure Jesus had a few arguments with the disciples. I'm sure there was grief and pain that they experienced, and they would have shared with Jesus, and Jesus would have spoken back to them. Sometimes in words of comfort, many times in, Peter, pull your head in. But we are assured that God has eternity in his hands, and that one day, even though many times we don't understand, God has this in control. And even if nothing else happens other than our heart gets closer to God and we are drawn closer into him and his community, then that is enough. And that can be enough. We follow God, Emmanuel. Despite our pain, despite our suffering, there is nothing that we will go through that God has not. That God has not gone through on our behalf, has not wept with countless people beforehand, and is willing to weep with us too and be there. And like the writer of Lamentations, we just need to remember, you know what? I have hope. I will find my hope not in the things that God has given me, not in the tools he has put at my disposal, not at the alternate ways I can deal with my grief or my rage. I will find my hope where? In him. And that is enough. Now, I know I haven't actually addressed the issue of why does suffering happen? Or what's the quickest way out of it? All the important questions that we'd want to know the answer to. But I hope I've given you assurance to know that we follow a God who actually does care and who can fix the problem. And no matter whether the issue was caused by our own sin and hypocrisy or caused by somebody else, whether it's grief that we take on behalf of somebody else, when we say, you know, I'll sit and mourn with you, or whether it's something we have no answer for, and that happens more often than not, we can go from this place knowing, you know what, I have hope in God, and I'll draw closer to God, and that is enough for me. And I think on a beautiful day such as today, that's where we're going to finish. We do have just one very short song that echoes that last lament. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. That's the summation of my summary, a summation of my sermon in a nutshell. And we're going to stand and we're going to sing. And then we're going to go out from here into a world that offers joy and pain, and we're going to take God into every single one of those.